Good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to chair this last plenary session of the conference on resilient communities. My name's Dave Brunsden. I'm from Kestrel Group, and in the context of this session, from the New Zealand Lifelines Council in respect of infrastructure resilience. We've had some very thought-provoking presentations at this conference, particularly from our international guests, about the contribution from low-damage structures to the resilience of our communities. And this session is intended to take that one step further to really focus on the journey out to that objective of more resilient communities. As we all know, resilience is easy to grasp at the concept level, but there are many challenges to define and work at it at the detailed level. It's, however, fundamental that it should be considered at every level, from household through organisations, through to government. And it was interesting when Minister Joyce opened the conference on Thursday in his reference to the importance of being a financially resilient country, which really extends that continuum right up there. We've got a great panel of speakers here for you this afternoon. There's a slight gender bias to it, but we can live with that. They've given considerable thought as to what resilience means through each of those levels, from household through the built environment, through to the community. And I'm really looking forward to their perspectives as how we, as earthquake engineering professionals, can contribute to making our communities more resilient. The way we're going to run this session is, it's not actually a panel. These will take one or possibly two questions after each of our speakers. We'll see how our 2 hours go as to whether we can have some additional questions at the end. But please make your questions strategic and crisp, and we'll try and make some time at the end. We start with an international perspective on resilience. Ron Mays is one of our regular returning Kiwis, with an illustrious career in the field of base isolation and energy dissipation, and has made a significant contribution to a number of technical committees in the United States and to the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute. In more recent times, he has co-founded the US Resiliency Council and is currently the Council's acting executive director. Ron is going to talk about the work of the Council, particularly building ratings, and how that informs and supports community resilience. Please join me in welcoming Ron Mays.
Thank you, David, and congratulations to everyone that's been able to last for the last session. What I'm going to do is provide an overview of what we've been doing on the west coast of the US with regard to a rating system and its impact on resilient design. This has been a great conference for me to see it from go to woe, and all the issues you're trying to address. I think we've got a solution for you to get started on that may help. So it's given in that measure to this is something that I think is worthy of consideration. So I'm going to repeat a number of things that have been said. I was in Christchurch for the 3 weeks immediately after it. What an unbelievably sobering experience. But the big picture takeaway was, did the building codes provide the performance expected? And from our profession, absolutely, they did a great job. They were life-safe. We knew that's what we were delivering. It's just that we told nobody. The public didn't know. So the public, expletive deleted, you can use whatever word you like. They didn't expect what we delivered. So therein lies the issue that's been talked about throughout this conference. The public really believe that, or many in the public, that a modern building code provides a disaster-proof, earthquake-proof building. And we know that's not what we're delivering. 100% NBS is going to prevent collapse, not to prevent injuries, but to prevent life loss, not to limit damage, and or permit quick recovery. The other big issue that I think we as structural engineers often forget is that the structural system is 20% of the cost of a building. 80% of it is the MEP systems, the architectural, and the contents. And when we look at losses in buildings, the losses, about 70% in many buildings, are to those aspects. And then, if a building has to close for 3 months or 6 months and the tenants or occupants have to be relocated, that cost overwhelms any other cost that we're talking about in terms of the amount of damage that may occur. So, business continuity, the ability to quickly recover, of course, is the whole resilience question. And when we consider the buildings in which we work and live, just to reiterate, it's my belief that the public knows very little about the performance of buildings in earthquakes and other natural disasters. Why is this important? Why should we care? Well, we should care because we're all here trying to address this issue going forward. When you think of the public perception again, what does 100%, 67%, 30% NBS actually mean in terms of building performance? I don't think we know exactly what it means, and certainly the public has no clue. And then when we start talking about low damage structural design, we have to stop that conversation. We've got to start talking about low damage building performance. The structure is an important part of that, but we have to change that conversation and take a holistic looking view of the performance of the complete structure. So what can be done? Clearly we need a way to communicate and educate the public about the earthquake performance of buildings. That's the challenge before us. Now when we look at lots of other fields, certainly in the US and I'm sure here in New Zealand, there's rating or ranking systems for all sorts of things, colleges, hotel and travel systems, cleanliness of restaurants in California, car safety. The public is very familiar with rating systems. It's not a new concept to them. They grasp that 5 stars is a lot better than 1 star and 3 stars is less than 5 stars, so we don't have to reinvent any wheels. We need to use a system that the public will grasp very quickly. Let me just try and put this in the context of resilience. What is resilience? And we've had lots of really good presentations. Essentially, it's how quickly a system or a city or a corporation recovers from a shock. We had a big one in New Orleans, and that really started the resilience movement in the US. So when the event happens, the resilience of whatever it is that you're talking about is the time that it takes to get back. And the more resilient a city, the quicker it recovers. And so this cost savings is shown in that red zone of the graph. And we have a really good example. It's not an earthquake example, but these all exist. This is New Orleans versus Nashville. And when we look at the GDP of those are 2 equally sized cities in the US, New Orleans in the purple and Nashville. In 2005, we had the big hurricane that hit and swamped New Orleans, wasn't prepared for it. And what happened was the GDP took a huge hit, whereas Nashville carried on, and the actual losses for the additional losses, in addition to the original 80 billion, there was another 105 billion, that's through 2012. So it's a big picture perspective that we need to be thinking of. The resilience of our communities has big impacts, and we play an important role. And what I'd like to do, because what I'm going to present to you is something that's brand new, but I'd like to put it in the context of the US Green Building Council. I know you have a different system down here, but the US Green Building Council was founded in 1993 to promote sustainable design of buildings. That took about 10 years to get a real uptake in our country. But 25 years later, everybody's requiring a LEED rating. And people that get the high levels of ratings actually have higher market value, as I'll discuss with you at the end. So there's value in better performing buildings. It's demonstrated in Japan in earthquakes, it's demonstrated in the sustainable design area, and it will be if we can bring market forces to bear on the seismic performance of buildings. So then when we think of resilience, this is Superstorm Sandy that hit New Jersey and New York. Pretty devastating effect, 70 billion in damage, 10 million cubic yards in debris. And there were hundreds of LEED certified buildings in that area. LEED buildings were designed to have lower impacts on the environment, but not for the environment to have a lower impact on them. So resilience is bigger than sustainability. If we're going to spend money to get sustainably designed buildings, we need to provide for a much higher level of seismic performance, otherwise we've wasted our effort, because that cost has got to be repaid when the damage occurs. And when we look at what's part of a resilient community, these are all critical elements of the whole bigger picture, the healthcare, the financial recovery, the emergency planning. It's a big picture issue that some of our other speakers are going to be touching on. But when we look at building performance, it impacts a huge amount of each of these issues separately. So the takeaway for this is that resilience of our building stock is a critical part of the big picture resilience issue for our cities. So what do we need? Public safety in the communities clearly need to know about the safety, how safe is the building, and when can it be reoccupied. The owners, architects, everyone involved in the building, they need to know what level of damage we might expect and how quickly it can continue to function again. So when we look at performance metrics, safety, that's our code design. And I think we've done a good job in providing life safety. But the big question for us all, is that sufficient? And I think the resounding answer to that is no. So the additional two metrics that we need to quantify as best we can is the expected damage and the recovery time, which is the resilience. And we have a tool, I'll talk about it in a minute, FEMA P58, SP3, which is a new analysis capability that allows us to develop these three components of a building performance. So we have the tools today for new buildings and existing buildings to estimate these three components of a building performance. So the FEMA P58 document, it took 10 years to develop, $12 million that were invested by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Association, and about 120 of our top people. So it's not perfect, it's going to develop better over time, but it's a great starting point. It's a probabilistic evaluation methodology. It produces the earthquake performance in terms of deaths, dollars, and downtime, results and implications that are expressed in ways that decision makers can understand. So we're translating all the gobbledygook that we talk to each other about, drifts and floor accelerations that mean nothing to an owner, but they do understand how much damage we might expect and how quickly we can get back in our building. Two critical metrics that we need to provide. And then I'll talk about the results being related into a rating system. So FEMA P58, the tool, is a probabilistic assessment that provides a very mathematically rigorous and conceptually elegant framework to assess the performance of tracking multiple and significant uncertainties. It produces the casualties, deaths and injuries in a building, the economic loss, the repair cost, and the indirect economic loss, the time to regain basic function. So, and coming next year is the ability to calculate the energy and carbon consequences of whatever's damaged in a building if it needs to be replaced. All in language that the owners can understand. Here's a quick graphic of the loss distribution results that you get as part of the assessment. 10% probability that the cost won't exceed $700,000. The median value, 50% repair, that the repair cost won't exceed $1 million. 90% probability that it won't exceed 1.5, or an 80% probability that's going to be so it's expressing it in probabilistic terms, which is what we're dealing with. And all these probabilities are included in the workhorse of the PAC software. In addition, and this is the big deal, it breaks down the damage by the components of the building. So you're able to see what parts of the building are causing damage. And so as designers, we can go back and get better performance, whatever, for some of the components that are causing damage. But as a preliminary design tool, this is fabulous. What I would suggest, New Zealand doesn't need to reinvent this tool. Begin with it. It needs to be New Zealand-fied, as I say. It needs to be taken and made applicable to a lot of the New Zealand conditions, but it's a great starting point, and there's no need to start from scratch. The US Resiliency Council was launched in 2015. I spent 4 years of my life getting this thing up and running, and it was quite an arduous process. But the intent is to establish and implement, it's the organization that implements the rating systems for earthquake performance. We've got 85 certified engineers. Los Angeles City are going to rate 800 of their own buildings to set an example for the rest of the city. This is non-mandatory at this point. The US Resiliency Council has 64 founding members. This is not Ron Mays' idea. This is the profession's idea. They contributed over $500,000 and thousands of hours of technical development. All our major professional organizations are founding members of the organization. Many large and small structural engineering firms, all our major hardware and software suppliers, many of whom are here at this conference, all contributed, and they're all listed on our website. In addition to that, as we developed the process, we had 45 stakeholders that weren't founding members but were important stakeholders, and they contributed to these definitions. So this is the rating system. 3 dimensions, 5 thresholds. These words are all carefully selected. The word unlikely is there because there's no absolutes in earthquake performance. But unlikely means about a 70% probability. So when the lawyers get stuck into this, we're not making absolute statements. Minimal damage, we're not talking about earthquake proof or a 5-star performance, we're talking about less than 5% damage. That's pretty good performance. And recovery, 5 stars is immediately to days, and you can see there's a range in the recovery dimension because that's the most difficult dimension we have to deal with. So what does it do? It gets the performance of the structure, the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems, the architectural components, and the cladding, partitions, and so forth, and it translates that into the information. But here's what it will do for us as a profession. A code design building is a 3-star building. We want owners to say, okay, what do I do to get to 4-star performance? 5-star performance. What does it cost? And we need the owners to be setting design criteria for their new structures and even their retrofits in these terms. We can translate that into the stuff that we do with the architect, but this is going to provide a mechanism for us to have an intelligent conversation with the owners of buildings that doesn't exist today. We just heard in the earlier presentation how difficult that is, and we think that once this gets established in 5 to 10 years, tenants of buildings are going to begin asking the owners, what's your rating? Because it's their employees that they're putting at risk when they're deciding on where to lease. So I think it's going to have a pretty significant impact. We had to overlay those dimensions with platinum, gold, silver, and bronze ratings. All of those satisfy life safety. And when we think about the value of community resilience, people pay for it. In San Francisco, they pay a premium for highly LEED-rated buildings because the tenants see value in that. They have no clue what their earthquake performance is, and they never ask. That must become part of the discussion with the owner and where they're going to work. In Japan, there's a premium of 20 to 25% for base isolation, which gives you 5-star performance. So if we have a system out there, people will begin to ask the right questions, demand better performing buildings, and we don't have to legislate any of this. So just to wrap up, these are the top buildings. A 4-story office building. It's in Sacramento, California. It's in a lower seismic zone, but it's our first platinum building. The next one is in Long Beach, California, 12-story reinforced concrete shear wall. It's not base isolated. But if you go through the design process and do a good job, you can get into the gold rating. What does it cost to get a gold premium building in new design? It's 1 to 10%. It's in the noise level of budgets of when they're originally set up. So this is another 2 buildings that got platinum ratings. We believe and hope that the US Resiliency Council in the US will do what the US Green Building Council did for sustainable design. It's going to make earthquake performance part of the conversation. And to conclude, I pose the question, we need a way to communicate and educate the public about the earthquake performance of buildings. We now have the tools and a rating system in the US that addresses this. Engineers need to play a leadership role in the resilience movement to help our cities and corporations become more resilient over time. We now have the tools to do that, and clearly the performance of the building stock is a critical element in the big picture resilience of our cities. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Ron challenges us on this each time he comes back every year, and we've been, as we focus on getting the new arrangements for the earthquake-prone legislation in place, but we can now see the mechanics fleshing out and the power of the potential power as a communication tool. And the quick question for you is emphasising that starting from a new building perspective, you feel is the strategic way, like the green buildings approach?
Yeah. We launched in December of 2015, so we're 15 months into the application side. The USRC has 1 half-time person, which was me, plus all our founding members, so it's a challenge to get this implemented and started, but where it's gaining ground right now is to get our cities to require a building rating, not a certain level, but to require a building rating of all new building construction with the building permit. So we start to get people to think about what the performance is of this new construction. Somehow we've got to get it into the process. And I think the easy way and the simple way, at least most cost effective, is to start with new construction. And then I can talk about all the issues with existing buildings, but the real estate industry is going to have something to say on that.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Ron. Challenge and opportunity noted. Our second speaker is Mike Mendonça, the Chief Resilience Officer from Wellington City Council. It's an appointment funded by the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities. Mike took up the position at the end of 2015 and hasn't stopped running since. His first key deliverable was Wellington's first resilience strategy, which he achieved last month. Notwithstanding the obstacles that were thrown in his way. With the Kaikoura earthquake, he's found himself in the role of recovery manager. And there is a nice symmetry, I have to say, between being recovery manager and resilience officer. It just leads to extra work. And he's had to work a lot more closely with building owners and engineers and seismologists than he probably ever envisaged. Please join with me in welcoming Mike.
Thanks, Dave. Look, with the greatest of respect, I think I might start with an insult. How about that? With the fantastic profession we have in this room, sometimes this fantastic profession doesn't tell a story as well as it might. I think storytelling is something that's missing out of this whole debate that we're having at the moment. Actually, Ron just kind of mentioned that himself. We've got a fantastic story about resilience in New Zealand and in Wellington in particular. And if you go back far enough, even to pre-European times and the Māori myth of how Wellington Harbour was created, two taniwha, two water dragons that lived in what was in those days a lake before the harbour was opened up. They were brothers, and one of them, Ngākei, the skinny one, got bored with swimming around and around the lake. So one day he decided to jump out of the lake and to go swimming in the Pacific Ocean to catch fish and enjoy life. He did that successfully, wound up all his strength, jumped over the edge of the cliff, and to this day is to be found swimming in the Pacific Ocean catching fish. His plumper brother, Whātaitai, thought he would follow, but it took him a few hours before he worked up the courage to do that. By the time he worked up the courage and jumped over the edge, the tide had gone out, and Whātaitai was stuck, prone, over the edge of the lake. The seawater rushed in, the harbour was created, and to this day, Whātaitai is lying there, turned to stone. He is what is now today the Miramar Peninsula, and his horns are now Barrett's Reef, where the Wahine tragically crashed. Some fantastic stories we have in New Zealand, and we don't tell them very well. One guy that did tell it really well was Sir Geoffrey Palmer. This quote gets popped up at every civil defence conference you go to. He actually said it in 1989, so here we are nearly 30 years later, Sir Geoffrey's story is still ringing. I just think that sometimes we conspire not to tell the story in a way that is compelling as it might be. I think that the Kaikoura earthquake is another opportunity for us to tell the story and have a reflection, think about where we've come from, think about our story, and the reason I want to tell the story is so that we can figure out what the next chapter of the story is. I love this picture of Thorndon, for 200 years old now, I suppose. If you look closely, you can see a series of streams, a series of areas where the earth has slipped. Actually, no coincidence, this is where we built Defence House and Rivera House. Part of the story is understanding where we've come from, what the city looked like in the past and what it might look like in the future. Not just the buildings though, the people as well, our economy. The reason that Māori came to Wellington was for economic reasons. Te Rauparaha saw, he was on one of his warpaths down to the South Island. He saw 3 Russian trading ships here off the Kapiti coast and decided that those Russian guys would have guns, muskets, so he came here specifically so he could trade with those Russians to enable him to have more military and economic might. I guess that's the start of our economic strength. I was really pleased to hear Ron talk about our economy. We all live here for a reason, don't we? And the people that live here because we can scratch out a living. If you can't scratch out a living, we wouldn't live here. So I think it's really important that we contemplate economic performance, economic resilience, when we're talking about other aspects of resilience as well. Look, there are 3 things I love in my life: my wife and kids, watching cricket at the basin, and fishing. That order changes from time to time, but I love telling the story about the basin, which was, of course, a lake until the 1855 earthquake. The lake was drained when that land raised, and some prisoners were used to flatten it out and eventually turn it to one of the finest cricket grounds in the world. After that, of course, Wellington became the capital. We started growing our infrastructure. We grew like Topsy, actually. We grew something like 500% in 10 years around the turn of the last century. This chap is the last person in Wellington to haul a night soil bucket. So before we put in sewage pipes, this is how we collected our waste. The irony of this, of course, is whilst we're all fine here talking about buildings, we need to also think about our lateral infrastructure, making sure that can support our buildings. No sense having buildings that can stand alone that aren't connected by water, lifelines such as sewage and other things. So ironically, if we lose our sewage system, our sewage reticulation, we're going back to our night soil days, probably using wheelie bins and trucks rather than horses and carts, but actually effectively the same thing. In between the world wars, of course, we used our initiative again. During the Great Depression, we used a bunch of unemployed guys to build all sorts of stuff around Wellington. This is the railway station. They also built the art gallery and the National War Memorial, and a whole bunch of other infrastructure in Wellington was built during that period. And in 1942, the forgotten earthquake, if you like, this one was massive. It actually destroyed or damaged 10,000 chimneys in Wellington. We've probably got them to thank, that earthquake to thank today, actually. If that earthquake hadn't destroyed most of our chimneys in 1942, we would probably have much worse chimney stock in Wellington today. And of course, the 42 earthquake really was the beginnings of the earthquake, what we know today is the Earthquake Commission. I kind of find it a bit eerie that the things that Mr. Ongley of Masterton District Council, I think, said at the time around us being lucky about this having happened at night time and talking about good design and good materials are pretty much the same messages that we have today in light of the Kaikoura quake. So I find that haunting. In fact, if I recall, almost exactly the same statement was made for the September 2010 Christchurch earthquakes. We've got the same challenges as 1942, and we have to learn. My job is to make sure we learn, and you guys have been really helpful in helping us to advance the city and New Zealand's resilience. You know, we've got some more work to do here. We need to have some honest discussions about what we're going to do with this stuff. We've got a bunch of problems that we need to solve, and I know we can solve them. To help us to do that, we'll be releasing our report next week on the 80 buildings. Be no surprise to you to know that there are 9 recommendations in there, which are centred really around 4 themes. Hollow core, of course, I know you've been discussing that extensively, what we're going to do there. Ground conditions, we need to understand better what's under the ground, all the way down to bedrock here in Wellington, around New Zealand. We need to take advantage of the opportunity around instrumentation and accelerometers. And finally, we need to have a think again, in light of all that stuff, about our rapid assessments. Have we got it right? How might we do those in the future, armed with the new knowledge that we might have with instrumentation in particular? There's lots we don't know, such as the nature of the profession. And as we learn more, we will make more changes, and together we will lead change. But we're really keen that we don't just focus on the last earthquake. We need to be thinking about what's coming next. Now, I can't tell you with any certainty what is the next earthquake, but we can't get stuck with just obsessing about the last one. A good place for us to start looking is the Wellington Earthquake National Initial Response Plan scenario. This scenario from the government's plan, which is available online, makes some assumptions. The assumptions include hundreds of people dying and tens of thousands of people being displaced from their homes. Having watched Christchurch, those probably aren't unrealistic assumptions to be making for a movement of the Wellington fault line. But my question and my problem that I would like to answer is, how can we challenge those assumptions? Why does it have to be that hundreds of people die and that tens of thousands of people get displaced? Can't we do something about that so that when we are faced with the Wellington fault line moving, we're not in as depressing a situation as we need be? So we're having a go at it, we're having a crack. As Dave mentioned, we've recently released the Wellington Resilience Strategy. We took our time with this thing, it took us a year, and US $1 million from Rockefeller Foundation, thank you very much Rockefeller, and the efforts of a whole bunch of people to come up with what the challenges are, what the goals are, and what we might do about it. After a year, we settled on 3 challenges, and these are simplified right down so that we can tell the story. Now, the first one might seem unrelated, but it's not. Our society is changing. We're all getting older, we're becoming more diverse ethnically, and we're getting greater disparity in incomes. We've got some choices to make as to whether or not we accept that or whether we do something about it. Of course, the earth is moving, and we know we're going to have a big earthquake one day in Wellington. And at the same time, the sea is rising. Now, these 3 things are interdependent, and if you start thinking about people, you start thinking about deprivation areas and where our most vulnerable people live, they are the worst affected by all 3 of those. What we want, what we desire, is in Wellington for everybody to be able to survive those challenges, but then thrive after them. Straight away you can see when I talk about surviving and then thriving, it's really easy to pass that into a discussion around life safety and damage. Once we've all survived, we've got to get back up on our feet and get our economy going again. We've settled on 3 goals in the strategy. Again, this is all about people. The first one is making sure that where we have areas like New Brighton and Christchurch, with the greatest respect to anybody from Christchurch, New Brighton was an area that was under stress before the earthquake. Post-earthquake, it is still stressed, but the shock exacerbated the stress. Worse, South Brighton's an area that's going to be strongly affected by sea level rise. We knew that before, we know this in Wellington. We're really keen to understand what we can do now so that when we have a shock, the effects aren't as great. The second one about decision making, yes, about councillors planning the city, but also about people who choose to come and work, live, play or study in Wellington. We think it's people's right to understand what the hazards might be in the city, what the context is and what they might do about it. At the moment, I've got to say we've got a whole bunch of information, but it's really hard to find. You need to know where to go to find it, and it's actually not very accessible. We've got the tools now using GIS and other instrumentation to make it much more accessible than it has been in the past. And finally, and this is the one that we tend to focus on immediately, but one of our goals is around homes and natural and built environment being robust. And the reason we're really focusing on homes, during the Kaikoura earthquake, we had between 5,000 and 7,000 people displaced from where they work here in Wellington. That was stressful for some people, but nothing like, and as I'm sure Peter will talk about, nothing like as stressful as being displaced from your home. So we're really keen that we don't just focus on commercial buildings, but on homes as well, and that we make sure that owners are thinking about resilient homes. We really worry about this. We've had this quake check system in place for about 5 years. Over those 5 years, only about 400 people have actually taken up the subsidised quake check. Really hard to get penetration of this area, and so we need to have a reset about how we might achieve robust homes. Do we need to think about bylaws, about using regulation to force building owners to do that? This is standalone homeowners I'm talking about. Do we need to think about funding and offering incentives? The other thing about homes, again, a standalone home is not sustainable, but a home with links to water, transport, telecommunications and energy is. So it's a good place to start because we all understand our home, but it's a good place to start having a discussion about other infrastructure as well. Look, I mentioned information and the need for us to understand better and to share the information. Here's just a brief example of some stuff we've been looking about the depth to bedrock in Wellington. Now, I have to stress that this is based on some reasonably old studies, 20-year-old master's thesis, I think. So I wouldn't want to stand by this, but it needs further proving. But this is the kind of information that we're keen to share with others and to understand what it means. So what we're looking at is the depth to bedrock, and floating above the depth to bedrock are the buildings that we know are severely damaged following the Kaikoura earthquakes. And what we're looking for is some correlations, and we think there is a correlation between the steepness of the bedrock and the damage that occurred on the surface. Really keen to understand that better, understand how that fits with structural engineering, and most importantly, what we might do about it, using our district plan, the Building Act, or other pieces of legislation. So, we've settled on a list of 30 projects. We started with 600 ideas, put those ideas through a bit of a machinery to settle on 30 projects that we've agreed with our councillors and other leaders to be the focus for the resilience strategy. Some of these things are quite technical and relatively communications-centric. Things like, for small businesses, for God's sake, sorry, that's not actually in the strategy, but make a plan. One of our enduring frustrations is getting small businesses to at least think about what you might do if you have an outage. So I'll actually be quite happy if that said, for God's sake, Wellington, make a plan. This is actually from something that Peter gave me. He probably doesn't remember. Peter Townsend, I walked into his office maybe a year ago to ask him if he had one piece of advice to give to the businesses of Wellington, what would it be? An hour later, I backed out of his office, him having kind of spent the whole time talking about this with passion, and about how this is what Wellington needs to be thinking about, because small businesses are the backbone of our economy, even though we're a government town. And you don't want to be the guy that's at the red zone protesting because you can't get a hold of your files or your server. So some of the stuff is technical and communication-centric. Some of the other stuff is tougher and longer term. So, for example, we know we live with the spectre of tsunami in Wellington. We expect hundreds of people to die when we have our earthquake. It turns out that most of those people are killed by the tsunami. Armed with that knowledge, why would we have housing intensification or any intensification in areas that we know are prone to tsunami? So it's that kind of thinking that we're really keen to have. That's a tough question that challenges private property ownership and private equity in homes. We're mindful of that, but we think we have a responsibility to have the debate, and by all means, let's do nothing, but let's do that explicitly and accept the risk rather than just assuming it'll go away. I've got to say, for the first time that I can recall, finally we've got emergency planners and city planners talking to one another, and I think that's fantastic. So just to wind up, we understand that we're talking about change here, be it hollow core buildings or be it the district plan, and people don't like change. So it's going to take some guts, a bit of political cojones, and some good communication for us to actually lead in this regard. We've got a bunch of key performance indicators around all of those projects, but a couple of things I'm really keen to see that, for me, will mean that we've been successful with some of this stuff. So at the moment, we've got tenants and I guess and building owners demanding a higher rating of MBS. I would dearly love, in looking at residential real estate section, for residential real estates to be talking the same sort of language, saying brick chimneys being secured or the subfloor structure is secure in this house. I would dearly love to see that. Would dearly love to see us exploiting the use of technology. With massive props to Quake Core, we're already well down this track, and I think that the vision we have of a wired-up city is a fantastic one, and really don't have anything standing in the way to stop us from doing this. So just in closing, can I please just say one more thing, and that is it's been a pretty tough few years for the engineering fraternity and profession. I would just like to say on behalf of Wellington City Council and Wellington, thank you very much. You've been fantastic and will continue to be fantastic. So can I just finish by saying, Dave, thank you. Cheers.
Thank you, Mike. As you can see, he's bringing a wonderfully fresh approach to the field of resilience and linking so much together. He's given us our second challenge for the afternoon, and that is earthquake engineers as storytellers. Do you have a question for Mike? Mary, please. Welcome to Mary Camario from...
I'm way too short for this stand. Mike, you talked about storytelling, and I think that's really valuable. I want to ask a kind of a tough question of you. Do you think that if there had been an emergency declaration after the Kaikoura earthquake in Wellington, a local one, it would have helped you explain more to the citizenry?
I guess we'll never know, Mary, but I'm happy to speculate. I think not. I think you know, there's a massive process you have to go through when deciding whether or not to declare. A whole bunch of stuff you have to take into account, not least being the reputation. The thing is that if you need the powers that you get when you declare, you need to be really clear on why you need them. With Wellington City, we never actually closed it. So we've got 20,000 people living in the CBD, and if we were going to declare, that had a whole bunch of consequences about what that meant for those people that live in the CBD. Didn't mean we were going to red zone the whole thing, of course not. But I don't think the issue, I think there were issues, but I don't think the issue is one of declare, not declare. I think the issue was one of governance and decision making, and it's fair to say at Wellington City we learned a whole bunch about that, and we're much clearer now on what needs to happen. I'll be more explicit. For a long time in Wellington, we've trained for the Wellington earthquake, and we do our exercises and things, and the Lifelines guys come along. We know what we have to do for the big Armageddon scenario. This actually wasn't the big Armageddon scenario. It was a much more, I've heard Peter, I think, say this is like a sniper's bullet thing that affected a certain building type. That was really where the effect was. But we pushed the button as though we were going to the Armageddon scenario. What we needed to do was gather the information that I've been talking about, take a deep breath, and make a decision based on the information that we had in front of us. And that decision wasn't a big declaration kind of thing. It was getting some of these clever guys, the guys from GNS, and again, being a sniper, targeting the bits that we needed to target. So for me, that's not so much about declaring or not declaring, but just being smarter about our use of intelligence, bringing together that information faster and using it to inform a timely decision. In the absence of full information, because you're never going to have full information, but I think if for us that's the big learning. Good question, thanks, man.
Answer, of course, aligns really neatly with Bruce Pepperell's comments in the opening presentation to the commencement of conference. Look, please join with me in thanking Mike for a very insightful presentation. Thank you. With, as I say, another challenge for us. The next speaker is John Vargo, who co-leads the Resilient Organisations research program along with Dr. Erica Seville. The Resilient Organisations program commenced in 2004, and when John joined shortly after, he brought a business and financial sector perspective which has supported the program's continued growth and expansion into a whole range of other sectors. He's going to talk to us about why the resilience of organisations is such a key component of resilient communities. Please welcome John. mishap whilst out on his bike, but we're grateful to have him along. I think it was his first outing from Christchurch, John.
We won't talk about that. Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Dave. Organizational resilience, what is it and why does it matter? Actually, we just leave them there, Dave, that way if I get in trouble, I know where to reach. As you probably picked from my accent, for those of you who don't know me, I'm not a native New Zealander. I'm from the US originally, from the city of Detroit. And they don't have earthquakes in Detroit. They have drive-by shootings and things like that, but no earthquakes. I moved to California in my early 20s after finishing my accounting degree at the University of Michigan, and took a job with a big electronics company called Fairchild Semiconductor in Silicon Valley. And I hadn't been there that long, months rather than years, and I was on the second floor of Building 5, which is their world headquarters, when I experienced my first earthquake. It wasn't a big one. It was probably a 4 or something along that line, but I definitely felt it, and I'd never felt the earth move before, and the building was sort of doing this thing, you know, and stuff was doing this thing, and I thought, okay, that's what an earthquake is like. And it wasn't long after that I went out and bought a book called Peace of Mind in Earthquake Country, which some of you may have heard of, may not have. It's not an engineering book, but it is about what makes earthquake-safe residential housing. And I learned a bit about that and built a couple of houses in California as a consequence of that. I did have another experience with earthquakes, however, though, on the 22nd of February. I live in Christchurch and have done since the 1980s, so I've been in New Zealand for a very long time. And I was on the 6th floor of the Commerce Building at the University of Canterbury, who was my employer at the time. And I got out of the building safely, got home safely, and in the following weeks, I was very grateful that the University of Canterbury continued to be able to pay me. That's a measure of their resilience and the nature of the country we live in. I was also grateful that I could go just a couple blocks away to a local New World supermarket, and I could still get food, even though it was in a somewhat more controlled fashion than I was used to. I could still turn my tap on and get water, although I did have to boil it, and our power came on pretty quickly. Those are all measures of resilience of organizations, how quickly they can come back to functioning and being able to serve our community and its purposes. Of course, it's not just about earthquakes. This is the Valentine's Day earthquake from last year, and of course, the Kaikoura earthquake. But there are other things that affect us besides just earthquakes that create change and turbulence in our environment. And some of these we've experienced in the not too recent past. So floods, uncontrolled people movements because of war, the global financial crisis, disruptive technologies which are heading our way and have both the positive and the negative aspects of them. Of course, we've got changing voting patterns and expectations from our citizenry. Brexit and Donald Trump and Le Pen. I'm not saying that, I'm not prognosticating what's going to happen in France, but there's a movement amongst the people that are part of the disruption that we're experiencing internationally. And of course, there are people falling off their bikes and breaking their hips, which was me. That's not me, but might as well have been. That was about 8 weeks ago. That's the reason why I am here. Whereas if it had happened 4 weeks ago, I would have had to give my apologies. So we've got all these things happening and creating all this turbulence, but in spite of that fact, the truth is the world is becoming more stable and less turbulent. Yeah, right. Is Tui would say. No, I'm sorry, but that isn't the world that we live in. The world we live in is a turbulent one. And my talk is about what is organizational resilience? Why is it important? So I've started off with, why is it important? I don't think there'd be very many people in this auditorium who would say, yeah, the world we're facing is more stable, less turbulent. You know, it's all good. It just doesn't look like that from the past few decades, and looking into the future, it looks more turbulent. And as a consequence, all the more reason why we need resilience and why our organizations need to be resilient. So that's a key. But what do I mean by resilience? Ron's definition of resilience was, how long does it take you to get back to functioning? And that time issue, and I agree with Ron. I think that's a really important one. But that's not the definition that Resilient Organizations uses for what makes an organization resilient. This is our definition. And it doesn't make our definition better, but we think it's fit for its purpose, which has two components to it. One is you've got to survive the crisis, okay? If your building collapsed and you closed up business because of an earthquake, you didn't meet the first criteria. But it isn't just about disasters, and it isn't just about crises and turbulence. It's also, well, it is also about turbulence. It's what do you do in an uncertain world? Are you able to thrive in that world, or are you just barely scratching along? Because we're facing a world that is more turbulent. None of us want our children and grandchildren growing up in a world where we're just barely hanging in there, do we? So we need to discover how can we thrive in a high change environment. Within resilient organizations, we'd say there are lots of ways of looking at this, but there are two ways that we can compare if you want to build your resilience. One is do some planning, and we think that's particularly important for critical infrastructure organizations, large organizations. In fact, we think it's important for everybody. It's just that a lot of people don't do it, or they don't do it effectively. And there are problems with the planning side of things if you're going to rely on your plan, because the difficulty is often what happens doesn't line up very well with the plan. And when that happens, then you may find that your planning actually wasn't that useful. The other piece of the picture to build your resilience is adaptive capacity. And that is really your ability to move with changing circumstances. You might have a good plan. It turns out to not line up very well with what actually happened to you, but because you're agile, because you're adaptive, your organization is able to continue to function and recover quickly and continue to serve the community. There are a lot of organizations that simply don't plan. Here's a guy from Christchurch. He didn't plan his backups for his computers. He had nothing to work with except his adaptive capacity. What did he do? Well, he just picked up his servers and walked out the door. You know, that worked for him. I know a lot of lawyers and accountants and engineers who had offices in the CBD of Christchurch who weren't that agile, they weren't that adaptive, and they weren't able to get access to their files for weeks, in some cases months, as a consequence. So we need both. We need good planning, but we also need adaptive capacity. So when we talk about organizational resilience, we have a particular mindset or frame in mind. It's built around a model that we've worked on. We've been at this for now 13 years, going on 14 years, thinking about resilience, helping organizations change, discovering what didn't work when our theories were tested by the Christchurch earthquakes, and what did work. And so we've got three fundamental attributes around which we think about organizational resilience. One is the leadership and culture of the organization. Second one is the networks and resources of that organization. And the third one is their change readiness, their ability to change given the circumstances. We've got 13 indicators. We have a couple of techniques and methods and tools for measuring this for an organization so that we can help benchmark them and help them figure out where their strengths, where their weaknesses are, and make change over time. And so you can see the 13 indicators clustered for leadership and culture, staff engagement, decision-making, situation awareness, and their innovation and creativity. Leadership is most important, though. Networks and resources include their partnerships with others, so they might be able to access resources they wouldn't have access to when trouble comes. Their internal resources, which includes their buildings, their insurance, their financial state. Leveraging knowledge. Can they spread knowledge within the organization and share it effectively? And breaking silos. Silos can be important from an efficiency standpoint for an organization, but typically they hinder communication, they hinder effective problem solving for systemic across the organization, they hinder putting resources where they're most needed when the organization comes under pressure. And so silos need to be dealt with. And then change readiness. Unity of purpose and proactive posture really could be in the top part because they're cultural aspects of the organization, but we also think they're important in terms of the agility of the organization. And planning strategies and stress testing those plans. And planning strategies include things like business continuity planning, risk planning, planning the development of a new building and then testing that plan with your clients, customers, employees. Those would be all aspects of planning. But I would have to say that not all of these indicators are equal. We believe these four, maybe one or two others, are more equal than the rest, you might say, more important. And as a consequence, there are ways of looking at resilience and processes that you can take, steps that you can take. And I'm going to describe two to you right now to improve your organizational resilience. The first one is built around those 4 indicators and that whole model. So I'll just drop back to just the attributes: leadership and culture, networks and resources, and being change ready. The first suggestion I'd say, if you want to build a more resilient organization, is to build some cultures within the organization that will make you more agile, your organization more agile and more adaptable. And those 3 cultures, the first one is what we would call a caring culture. And this is work that was carried out under an MB grant by some colleagues of mine in the business school, Bernard Walker and Associate Professor Nillikant. A caring culture is one that demonstrates to your employees that you care about them and therefore you're willing to listen to them. You care about their ideas. It's not just touchy-feely. In our research post-earthquake in Christchurch, we found the #1 issue for the majority of organizations was the well-being of their staff. They were concerned. They could move buildings, but they were concerned their employees wouldn't show up. Then they were going to be out of business. So that was critical. So build a caring culture, one that causes your employees to trust you, because that is the foundation stone for organizational resilience. In the end, if you took nothing else away, it's trust, because it's that lubricant that keeps relationships within an organization functioning, that causes your employees to give you their good ideas, put out a risky idea, because if they don't trust you, they won't offer that good idea. Sharing. Create a culture where your employees are prepared to share with one another. They're prepared to cross the boundaries within the silos, share good ideas, share their resources, share their concern and help. And the third of those cultures is a learning culture. And these are all built on one another. You won't get a learning culture if your employees are unwilling to share their good ideas with their boss because they don't trust their boss, or with their colleagues in another department because they don't trust them. So building on trust, and they're not going to be prepared to share unless that trust starts with a caring aspect. So if you want to build a more agile and more adaptive organization, it needs to be a learning organization, and it's dependent on building these 3 cultures. The second suggestion I have is actually somewhat related to the first one, and that's practice resilience as a team sport. That really has to do with the silo side of things. It has to do with working with one another. It has to do with your external partnerships. It has to do with your situation awareness. So it actually crosses the boundaries across those 13 indicators and those 3 attributes. So what do I mean practicing resilience as a team sport? Well, we did a study with the Bay of Plenty Lifelines group initially 2 and a bit years ago, and we're doing a repeat with them now. About 30 organizations overall in terms of units within, 3 councils, and a range of other Lifelines organizations as part of it. We ran a benchmark study so they could compare it to one another and learn from one another. One of the things they learned from one another was they were really good at some things and not so good at other things. One of the things they weren't so good at was stress testing their plans. One of the things they were very good at was creating really good plans. The other thing they weren't very good at was collaboration. So what they decided to do was start stress testing their plans in a more collaborative fashion, because as part of the study, they also discovered the interdependencies that some of them they were aware of, but others of which were invisible to them. And as a consequence of that piece of work that we did with them, we believe they've significantly increased their resilience. We're just analyzing the data now, so we'll actually know a bit more soon. The last thing I want to talk about is this little critter here. This is the krill. It is the keystone species in the Southern Ocean. If you know what a keystone species is, if the krill were to die in the Southern Ocean would probably die because it's at the bottom of the food chain and is the basis for everything else that happens. I would assert that organizations fill a similar role in modern society because our organizations provide our goods and services, they provide our employment, they're the foundation for our economy. There would be no tax base without effective organizations and no employment. So having resilient organizations is quite crucial to how quickly we recover as a society from a major event. If we have resilient organizations, then they will be part of the solution when something bad happens, rather than being part of the problem. Thank you very much.
Great, John. Another wonderful summary of the tools and the concepts that resilient organisations are continuing to bring through to help practitioners. Any questions for John? There's no questions, John.
Give them a moment.
I was about to make some comment about where engineers fit in the food chain, but we won't go there. Having propped you up neatly like that. Woody.
John, so you're expecting progress out of Hawke's Bay, but you've now been resilient organisations have been observing New Zealand for a while. What has happened
What's happening?
in terms of resilience?
Well, I think there's a number of very good things happening. First of all, I'd have to say I think New Zealand's probably one of the most resilient countries in the world, to be frank. Part of it's because of our egalitarian society. Part of it's the fact that we're spread out, but we're also exposed to a lot of hazards. And so it's a bit of a mixed bag from that standpoint. But what's happening? A number of things are happening. So Mike just spoke to you about the 100 Resilient Cities initiative. And we have two cities in a small country like ours. Australia's got 2 also, so we're way ahead of them. We're punching above our weight, as we like to say, with Christchurch and Wellington both as part of the Rockefeller network, the 100 Resilient Cities network. I think that's a very positive initiative from Rockefeller, and the fact that New Zealand has really struck gold there. We have a lot of benefit yet to flow as a consequence of being part of that network. Also, MB has funded a range of national science challenges. Many of you may be involved in some of them, or at least aware of them. One of those is called the Resilience Challenge, or Resilience to Nature's Challenge. There are 60, 70, 80 researchers around the country from across 14 organizations involved with that, including most of the universities, a couple of the CRIs, resilient organizations, and a number of other organizations involved in that. And I think that's a major initiative, but it's going to take some time to deliver the goods and figure out what will make New Zealand more resilient, and how do we go about measuring that? How do we know that it's actually true, not just we hope so? And so I think that's a major initiative. I think that's a really good thing that's happening. I think the ideas, and not to steal the thunder of a couple of my further speakers, but I think New Zealand is really putting some effort into building its social capital, our ability to get along with one another. And we certainly saw that in Christchurch. The problem is that disaster-related social capital, that which arises as a consequence of the disaster itself, tends to attenuate over time. So I could give you a lot more, but I'm sure I've just about used up my time there.
John, thank you for painting us a much wider picture, and again, the planned and adaptive concept that he outlined is something that resilient organisations has brought to this discussion. And if we get a chance at the end, I'll show you how that is one of the concepts being woven into the forthcoming National Disaster Resilience Strategy. Please join with me in thanking John for his special effort in attending. Are you right there?
Yep, I'm good.
I think he's done a bit of planned and adaptive today to get here and hopefully return home safely.
Yeah.
Our next speaker, also from Canterbury, Peter Townsend, has held the position of Chief Executive of the Canterbury Employers Chamber of Commerce since 1996, which I find an amazing statistic. He also holds directorships in several sectors, including having served on the SERA Transitional Advisory Board, and is currently a director of Otakaro Limited. In 2013, he was made a companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit. As befits all that experience, he has been a widely respected commentator, nationally and internationally. Just returned from Mongolia, he was telling me, on business impacts, and particularly in the recovery from the Canterbury earthquakes. And he's going to share his thoughts with us on the connections between business and community resilience. Peter Townsend.
Kia ora tātou. Great to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me along today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happened in Christchurch post-earthquake and some of the key issues that were really, really critical for the business community. And I've done a bit of a sort of a patch job of some various addresses that I've given in the recent past, and I hope you'll find some of this interesting. The first thing I want to do is show you a video, and just to lighten things up a bit, because you've been sitting there very patiently listening to people talk, so let's see how we go.
In the centre of the city, we had 6,000 companies that just had to cut and run. The city was then cordoned off for a couple of years. So that was an incredibly graphic example of how the earthquake impacted on business. A community without business is a community that will collapse. We had no power, we had no water, we had no sewerage, we had no effective supply chains. We were frustrated for 2 years in getting back into our central city, and that's where the likes of the Canterbury Employers Chamber of Commerce and the Canterbury Development Corporation, through a joint venture called Recover Canterbury, came to be a safe pair of hands for business. And with all of the frustrations that we've had, this is now a city with opportunity.
It would be another tragedy not to make the most of it and take advantage of the opportunity we've been given. I don't think any one of us took our eyes off the prize, which is a 21st century city. We've really felt extremely positive about what our city's going to become. It really will live up to that reputation.
I know for a fact that 80% of the land in our central city is either consented or there is building underway. And I always like to remind people that we're only halfway through the construction side of the rebuild. We've spent about $17 billion reconstructing commercial buildings, housing stock and horizontal infrastructure, including all of our underground wiring and networking. We've still got about $17 billion to spend just to get the reconstruction side of our city up and running. I don't know anywhere in the world where $100 million a week is being consistently applied to the rebuild of a city of 400,000 people. We're going to be the safest city in the Southern Hemisphere, because although we've got a seismic history and we'll probably have a seismic future, we're building to accommodate that. We're going to have an energy efficient city because all of our buildings are being built to new code. We've got 25,000 houses that are either being completely rebuilt or seriously repaired. So the whole energy profile of the city is changing.
We actually have the opportunity to embed smart technology into the future. It's a smart city, it's an intelligent city, it's a resilient city. The companies that serve the city have really served the city well and will take us into that 21st century. We've had an ambition in this city for 20,000 people to be living inside the 4 avenues. If we could deliver that, then I think we'll set this place on fire.
It will be a city that faces its future, and it will be a city that appreciates its place in the South Island.
So that just gives you a bit of a taste of what's going on in Christchurch, and of course the engineering profession's deeply involved in building those buildings, and you will have seen a lot of steel going into the rebuild of Christchurch as opposed to a lot of concrete that was taken out. Look, just to summarise, I'm not going to spend time on this because it's common knowledge now, but it's worth reminding ourselves of what happened in Christchurch with 2 earthquakes, September 2010 and February 2011. The February 22 earthquake was the big one that cost us our lives, 100 seriously injured, over 100,000 homes damaged. That's hard to comprehend, and as I said in that video, over 25,000 of those homes had an excess of $100,000 worth of damage. 10,000 of those were destroyed altogether. So it's a population of 360,000 people. It's a big hit. 80% of the core CBD, as you could have seen from one of those shots there, are gone. 6,000 businesses had to just cut and run from the central business district, and they were cordoned out of that, as I said, for 2 years. Enormously complex issues that arise when businesses just have to get out. And the extraordinary thing about that, and I want to talk about it a little bit more in detail, is that the normal churn rate for business in Christchurch before the earthquake, and it'll be the normal churn rate for business wherever you come from, is about 11.4% per year. Post-earthquake in Christchurch, 11.6, almost within the margin of error. And I was told quite categorically by many overseas experts that we could expect to lose 30% of our businesses in post-earthquake Christchurch. You could count them on one hand, and the ones that left have come back, and the ones that stayed have thrived. So it's been a really extraordinary story of business survival and business resilience, and we've heard that word a lot today. Estimated total cost of $45 billion, probably approaching 55 billion all up now. The 17 billion I referred to as being halfway through the construction side of the rebuild represents about a 34 billion commitment to commercial buildings, housing stock and horizontal infrastructure, but there's a whole lot more going on in the city than that in terms of land remediation and redevelopment and big infrastructural programs. So the impact on business, as I said, the city was cordoned off. The centre of the city was cordoned off for 2 years. The services had gone. We had incredible complications with insurance. I like to remind people that $33 billion worth of private insurance is being applied to Christchurch. Remember that population, 360,000 people. Nowhere in the world has $33 billion worth of private insurance been applied to a population of that size to rebuild a city. It has never happened before, and it will never happen again, because the insurance company have changed the way they do things now. But most of us were insured for full replacement, and that is underpinning the rebuild of Christchurch. If you look at where the building is taking place and who's doing it, it's basically insurance proceeds, apart from the commitment that local government and central government are making to the rebuild. Extraordinary complications with 6,000 businesses having to vacate the city. Of course, they had to go find somewhere else to live. One of the big lessons we learned was having a plan B in the case of disaster. When they went out to the outskirts of the city because they had to, there were long-term lease arrangements demanded because they could be, and we all thought that was going to create incredible complications for getting people to come back into the central city. We didn't realise at that time that it was going to take 7 years to rebuild the central city, so a 7-year lease is not such a problem anymore. And of course, as already been mentioned, the need to look after staff. The fundamental primary premise of any post-disaster activity from a business perspective is looking after the people and the people looking after their families. And we noticed that with the 53 earthquakes we had over 5 on the Richter scale post February 2011, that people would just cut and run from their work and go and attend to their families, and so they should have. And we had to adopt a very flexible environment for our businesses. We set up, as was mentioned by Mike, we set up Recover Canterbury in the post-earthquake environment. I like to say that we just stole the mandate to represent the entire business community. The Canterbury Employers Chamber of Commerce has about 3,000 businesses as members. Post-earthquake, we teamed up with the Canterbury Development Corporation, which is the local economic development agency, and we just provided the services as a safe pair of hands for the entire business community. And that was a website, it was a call centre. We had 30 business recovery coordinators on the road, and the government helped us fund those. And we've set up a trust that enabled funds to be collected to be applied to businesses. And the legacy of that is that there's still money being paid out from that trust to help businesses as they go back into our rebuilt central city. So this was an incredibly important thing, but we created the whole thing post-earthquake. It was September the 6th, 2010 that Recover Canterbury was formed, 2 days after the September 4 earthquake, and it really came into its own post-February 2011 because the city was running the risk of really being on its knees. But Recover Canterbury, having a business support agency, providing a safe pair of hands for business, giving business certainty, fundamentally important in a post-disaster scenario. The other support that came through was from government. Not only from government, we arranged, the Chamber of Commerce arranged access into the cordon for people like John showed who were carrying their servers out of the rubble. We did that with civil defence. We took gangs of people in with hard hats and high-vis gear for 30 minutes at a time under the auspices of civil defence and the rescue people, Landsar people, so that they were safe as they could be. We got involved in frequent communication, just keeping people up to date all the time. And really, really important, what I learned from this earthquake experience is that cash is king. If you supply cash to companies post-earthquake to protect the integrity of the company so that they can continue their employment relationship when they don't have any business, in other words, it's business as usual when there is no business, then that enables those companies to recover really quickly when things start to get a little bit back into a normal scenario. And our government, which is not known for giving away money, our government committed $250 million. They didn't know at the time, but they ended up committing $250 million in earthquake support subsidies to provide a payment to each employee of affected companies on a very high trust basis. So the companies just had to provide their bank account number, their IRD number, their the number of employees they had, and the money was paid on a high trust basis into their bank account on a $350 per employee per week. After February, $500 per employee per week, with no questions asked. And that saved thousands of companies. I still get people today approaching me saying, if it hadn't been for the earthquake support subsidy, we wouldn't have been able to survive because we were run out of cash when there was no business going on. So an extraordinary intervention that has paid huge dividends, and we initiated that from the Chamber of Commerce. In fact, I recall Bill English, who was Minister of Finance at the time, ringing me on September the 6th saying, what are we going to do, Peter? And I said, we're going to have to put cash into companies. If we don't, the companies will collapse this week. And his response was, I understand that, how much? And then that's what's come out of that. And that's exactly what's happened in Wellington and in Kaikoura in more recent events. And the government has seen the wisdom of that. It's not a gift by government, they get it back. They get it back because they've protected the integrity of the companies that continue to pay tax, continue to pay PAYE and GST and all the rest of it. So it's not a gift, but it's a really interesting intervention. So key lessons that we took out of Christchurch: need to provide hope and certainty. I have been often accused of being a ridiculous optimist, and when I'm asked why I'm so optimistic, my immediate response is, what's the other bloody choice? You want me to be pessimistic? The reality is that, as you've seen, Christchurch is a city of opportunity, and there's great cause to be optimistic. Quick and coordinated support, expertise on the ground, particularly around those complex areas of insurance. I've mentioned the importance of cash flow. Never underestimate the importance of having cash into communities that are under stress. It is so, so important. Frequent and accurate communication, including with your staff. Crisis management planning. Survival of limited liability companies was extraordinary. I always thought a limited liability company was a limited liability company, but it isn't. A limited liability company is part of your soul, it's part of your family, it's part of your spirituality, it's part of your social fabric, it's certainly part of your commercial fabric, and people risk their lives to save their companies. It was quite extraordinary. Flexible entities to meet changing needs and need for positive media. This is a quote that I'll remember until I die. Dutch Leonard, I think he's Professor of Public Affairs at Harvard University. As you recreate Christchurch, you must recreate it to ride the great tailwinds of our time, not the tailwinds of yesterday. And let me tell you, for a monocultural, myopic, conservative, inward-looking city like Christchurch, that's a big call, but it is happening. Christchurch is riding the great tailwinds of our time. So, Kaikoura earthquake, you've heard a lot about that in this conference. We have 3 people actively involved in Kaikoura assisting businesses using the lessons we learned from Christchurch, and those lessons have proven to be extremely valuable, including an employer support subsidy, but a lot of other stuff that's going on in Kaikoura. And this is the Kaikoura website. You'll see there that they can slot straight through to the Canterbury Employers Chamber of Commerce, and we offer them free membership. Any businesses in Kaikoura can join us for nothing, so we can support them on the way through. Just wanted to show you this video to finish.
No mai haere mai ki o tautahi. Welcome to Christchurch, a city of opportunity.
Huge possibility.
There's something very special here. We're rebuilding a modern Western city.
Absolutely, we're a growing community. That's what we're all about.
Growing our minds.
Growing our careers. We're ranked in the top 3% of the world's universities.
There's definitely a really buzzing startup community in Christchurch.
An economy that supports really great things.
It is a city of opportunity, and there is a lot going on.
It's everything. You've got everything right at your doorstep. Everything's easy to get to, everything's easy to be part of.
And increasingly a really creative city with an amazing art gallery.
It's home. It's just a great place that's got a great way of life.
Adventure is on your back doorstep with the mountains, the rivers, the surf. You can go surfing and skiing within 2 hours of each other.
It's 5 minutes to the playground.
10 minutes to work.
It's 15 minutes to the beach.
And 20 minutes to the rest of the world.
So you live the good life, but also see the rest of the world. It's perfect.
The opportunity to be here, to have a family here, to have a business here, to become part of something that is growing, it's something that shouldn't be missed.
Christchurch.
The best place in the world.
Live the Kiwi dream.
And I'd like to announce that I finished within 2 seconds of my allocated time. Thank you.
Inspiring, thank you, Peter. And again, very timely here, given some of the physical challenges that we face. But having worked alongside and with Canterbury Development Corporation and just seeing the innovative way they supported so many of their industries after the Canterbury earthquakes, I just endorse that example of leadership in practice from a business association perspective. Any questions for Peter? Again, a hard act to follow with that presentation. Look, we'll leave it there, but is it?
So thank you for a good big picture. How do you think, considering the topic of the conference, so low damage, trying to get a building system, you were discussing about energy efficiency, the whole 9 yards of a safer, better, more comfortable, more appropriate living. How do you think that this can be enforced and incentivized in the reconstruction of Christchurch?
Yeah, well, it is being enforced through a new building code, and there are new expectations in terms of seismic resilience and general building construct. You see that play out all the time, and the consequences of that, the unintended consequences of that, are what I mentioned about things like energy efficiency. The irony is that Christchurch is now, without any doubt at all, the safest city in the Southern Hemisphere. And it's safe because all the shonky buildings have gone. And we're building new buildings that, as I said, are built for our seismic future. We will have a seismic future, but we're building to that. I mean, I can say I lost my house in the earthquake. I put $30,000 worth of compacted gravel down to bedrock underneath the foundations of my house, and then I put a rib raft concrete foundation sitting on the top of that compacted gravel with more reinforcing steel than the Titanic, and it's a steel-framed house with lightweight construction with 3 times insulation, and I am one of 25,000 people who are rebuilding their home in Christchurch along those lines. And so you're going to end up with something that's very special. Now, I think the ultimate, and I was really interested to hear the previous comments, because I think the ultimate enforcement of this, this new expectation in terms of building strength and building resilience is the market. The market will determine eventually. And I really applaud people who are looking at ways of getting better communication to the public, not only for commercial buildings, but for their houses, on where it sits on a scale and how safe it is and what will happen to it if something does go wrong and some national disaster happens. Ultimately, that will be why we end up with the safest buildings in the world.
Thank you, Peter. And again,
thank you.
With an underpinning strategic message, perhaps, of the importance of continuing to have insurance cover for events of that scale. And that gets back to, again, financial resilience. Our next speaker, as we get into the more into the social domain of understanding the social aspects of resilient communities, is David Johnston, Principal Scientist at GNS, but also Director of the Joint Centre for Disaster Research at Massey. Dave is one of New Zealand's most experienced researchers across both the physical and the social sciences, with a focus on communication strategies. Last year, he received the Minister of Civil Defence's award for his important contribution to civil defence and emergency management over several decades. Please welcome David.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak. And sort of what I'm about is, so what about the people? Many of you engineers think your buildings are very complex, but I'm sure most of you would agree, if you have a partner or children, that humans are actually far more complex. So understanding human behaviour and how we as society deal with these issues is complicated and really is probably a conference in itself, and there has been many of those. What I want to do is sort of touch on some key learnings that we've learned, and once again, many of them come out of our experience from the Canterbury earthquakes, but also more recent events, but also going back in time. I was in the US on the 4th of September 2010 during a project out in eastern Washington looking at low seismic hazard zones, and I got a text, and it was a GeoNet alert, and there'd been a 7.1 in Canterbury, and so being daytime, I was able to see CNN broadcasting the story of the Canterbury earthquake with about one news short clip being repeated over and over again of car alarms and bricks, and so my world changed. Much of my work prior to that had been looking at future disasters, and without New Zealand having a large urban disaster for many decades, we had had a number of events, and they were significant to those impacted by it, but the Canterbury earthquakes really gave us the first time since 1931 what a large urban disaster would mean to a nation, and that threw up many challenges. And between September 2010 and February, I discussed with many of my disaster research colleagues, it was a time that the phone never rang, that we had been studying disasters, and what we saw through much of the response, and this may be unfair to some, but what we saw was what I described then as a scaling up as business as usual, as agencies were dealing with the aftermath of the September earthquake. And then in February 2011, everything changed. It was, I refer to that time as the time the phone never stopped ringing. We as a nation understood that we had issues that we were facing that were unprecedented in recent times. And it was many of these issues that we had to deal with, how to deal with an earthquake. And we've heard about the impacts on businesses, about organisations and some of the challenges. But many of the agencies in New Zealand who are responsible for caring for people in many different departments, from the health and well-being, education, were also meeting similar challenges, and they were uncharted territory for most people. As I said, we hadn't had a large urban disaster, and we all learned as a country that the disaster context is different from a non-disaster context, and many things have to happen. So one of the lessons that we often talk about is our failure to learn lessons. There's been many examples of events occurring time and time again, and the after actions reports come up with the same so-called learnings, but do we actually learn? And in February last year, 2016, there was a large conference, and some of you may have got to it. It was called People and Disasters. It was driven from the health community, a lot of looking at the social issues and learnings from the Canterbury earthquake. And what I want to do now is just to summarise some key learnings from that, and that really gives us an insight to some of the social issues. There is a learnings report, it's on the website, and I can get a copy to it, and it comes up with 26 key learnings, and I've high-graded 10 that I want to share with you now that really points to some of the issues we need to think about from a social dimension going forward. And some of them are common sense, and some of them have been articulated by some of the speakers before. But what we've seen from the Canterbury earthquakes and other disasters, and this is the global observation, that actually most people are resilient to disasters and will self-heal. So despite the trauma, the suffering, the upset that we may have, the life course for most citizens in our community will fix themselves with time, given appropriate support. But we use the word most, but that is not all. So there are people who are affected by disasters, but the majority of people, it often is a positive outcome in their life course, even after the hardships that they face at the time. However, we do know that the psychosocial support is essential, both in long-term and short-term, in that disaster response. And it has been actually a great pleasure and an opportunity to work with the agencies, with SERA, the SERA Wellbeing Group, with the DHB down there, the All Right campaign, looking at how New Zealand as a nation has adopted international best practice around the psychosocial support for this event. And we've seen many programs implemented, and includes the business, getting the funding to the workers, it's organisational stuff that actually made a difference and has helped most of the members of our community get through this. And I use the word most because it doesn't mean that all people have had good outcomes. The sad thing is, in disasters, bad things happen to good people, and many people do not have good outcomes, and we need to understand that and acknowledge that and treat those people and those communities with support that they need for a long time afterwards. What we learnt quite quickly at the Canterbury earthquake, and many of you down there will have experiences, that immediately after the event, it is the physical event you went through or the direct consequences or secondary consequences from that that are the main issue. So in the wellbeing survey that Sarah did for and has been going for the last 5 years, a 6-monthly survey around wellbeing issues, in the first few surveys it was the aftershock sequence that was one of the biggest reported stresses. But that disappeared quickly, and it was actually the most stressful situation reported by Cantabrians is dealing with insurance issues. So actually the event itself often people come to terms with, they report it scary at the time, they didn't like it, they don't like aftershocks, but it is actually the biggest impact on society with the secondary stresses associated with the recovery process for many people. And as we've seen and we all know, it was a complex event, so it was always going to be a long, complex process. So some of these secondary stresses are predictable and in some ways understandable, but we need to acknowledge that they are the major cause of stress for the population in the time after the immediate impact of these events. What we tried to do in Canterbury, working with a number of agencies, and there are many agencies involved in the CERA working group with NGOs, was to try and develop appropriate indicators to see how well the recovery was going from the social aspect. There are many indicators, obviously, about the rebuild, about the economic activity, but the psychosocial recovery is also a tricky one. Because there are new groups of people impacted by the event, many of the existing measures for measuring vulnerability in our society, educational achievement, crime, health measures, don't actually fit for purpose in a post-disaster context. The term was often used about the new vulnerable. New groups of people in society are vulnerable in a post-disaster time that are not vulnerable in a pre-disaster time. That doesn't mean that there aren't existing, and this is the next point, pre-existing vulnerabilities in our community. What we also do know from the Canterbury experience and global research is that, sadly, pre-existing vulnerable populations have disproportionate impacts on them. Things get worse for those who are already not having a good time at the time of the event. And I think that's a testament to the effort by many agencies to address these vulnerable populations. And one could speculate, and I would suggest we probably need to do more work in this area, is that the outcomes for the most vulnerable members of our society weren't as good as they could be, and maybe we need to look at that. And that comes to some of the policies after the earthquake about housing repairs and winter targeting the most vulnerable people first, necessary than just having a blanket targeting. Those changes did occur in the second and third years after the earthquake, when we saw certain groups were not doing as well as we would like. But I think that's a lesson from disaster research from the last 100-odd years in all disasters, is that it does prey on the most vulnerable in our society. But I'm going to come to a more positive point in number 7 when it reappears. What we also found is that there is a link between, and this is well known, about earthquake-related stress and health outcomes. We often, and many people in Canterbury will testify this, when you're really busy, when you're stressed, when you're out of work, there are certain activities, healthy activities, that often get passed away. Exercise, cycling, and other things, which are often time dependent. And when time is short, we'd probably eat things that we probably shouldn't be, because it's part of a coping mechanism. So the Ministry, the District Health Board, the Ministry of Health, many others are aware that we need to look at some of these issues, and we all experience that. What's more positive actually is that although many pre-existing vulnerabilities can worsen in disasters, what we did see is that specific community strength-based and culturally appropriate interventions can create resilience in individuals and communities. And we saw groups who may have not participated in certain ways, and this is some of the youth. The earthquake creates opportunities. There are positive sides to it, and we've seen that employment opportunities, we've seen that culturally, we've seen that in many aspects of our society. That disasters and large sort of negative events do create opportunities, and I think the adaptive response of agencies, including in the engineering profession, the way we design things, the way we organise our societies, they create opportunities for good, and we've seen many examples coming out of Canterbury. We're seeing those opportunities coming out of Wellington, and hopefully we'll see those opportunities coming out from other places like Edgecombe, that actually disasters can be a time for positive social change and structural change in society that leads to better outcomes, and often then has the either political support or the economic support to allow these changes to happen. So there can be, and often is, and in the Canterbury situation, a silver lining, and I'll say in the Wellington situation as well, from these events. But that relies on having a plan and being adaptable, as John pointed out. So disasters can be good for society. But when we talk about this and we're being positive about this, we must not forget that previous point is that those outcomes, those positive outcomes, are not uniform, and there are vulnerable people we need to look after in our society, because the good times are not shared evenly, and we do need to address the vulnerable groups that aren't sharing in those benefits. What we also see, and there are many other sectors, but I've just got a couple of these points, is that the education sector, and once again I will acknowledge the work that the Ministry of Education did and the schools in Christchurch, the educational outcome achievements in the year after the earthquake in Canterbury were above the national averages, despite the impacts on schooling. We know that the education sector is essential for the community recovery, not just the children and adolescents who are being looked after in the schools, but as part of social capital and the recovery process. I wouldn't underestimate the importance of integrating with the education sector in building resilient communities and their role in it. And we are doing a lot of work around, and Ministry of Education are doing that around about safer schools, but there's a wider role of schools in the communities that we've seen from Christchurch that make a difference. This point number 9, which is around getting back to work, and that really speaks to the income subsidy, but also the innovative approaches that businesses took to go back to work. Going back to work may not mean going back to your damaged building, but it might be operating in a different way from home offices. We know if people can return to work more quickly than others, social recovery will be expanded. And the last point that I want to mention, I see the time is ticking down, is that the importance of storing and sharing these earthquake experiences in helping social recovery. And we've seen that in the Christchurch and Canterbury experience, but I believe that this should not just be done in a post-disaster event, but an opportunity going forward in a resilience building. So as we started off with a story, so it really speaks to the point of Mike's introduction about the pre-European time in Wellington, and the sort of stories and the narrative about resilience. The narrative about resilience is also within the engineering domain. There are stories of success, and we do that. We have displays at Te Papa, and what we would say is that they are very important, not just to engineering, but to wider society. So we need to be talking to the communities about the things you're doing to build a safer community and involving in it. And they have benefits beyond just the engineering solutions. They do help build resilient communities. And I'm counting down with 15 seconds to go. So I'll thank you, and hopefully we can become a resilient community. And thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Anyone going to jump up to the microphone with a question?
David, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I have a question, and sort of present company excluded. Christchurch went through quite a significant event, and there was sort of quite a lot happening. Living through it myself, felt it quite keenly. Wellington then followed on, and the question I've got is sort of how much did the Canterbury event prepare the people of Wellington, rather than just regarding it as a Christchurch problem, present company excluded, who have been working in it for years. How many people in Wellington were actually prepared by the experience in Christchurch?
I think you raise a really important question, and it's one that I've been thinking about and worrying about for a long time. One of the things that struck me in 2012 when living in Christchurch, and one of the things I've been sort of campaigning for, is that we don't turn the Canterbury experience into a story about the Canterbury experience, and how do we, or maybe the challenge is, how do we turn it into a New Zealand experience? How do we take the teachable moment out of a location into a location that has not had the event? Because the next large urban earthquake, I said this many years ago, was probably not going to be in Christchurch, it will be somewhere else. And I think we can make Christchurch the most resilient city for the next Christchurch earthquake, but how do we make it for the Palmerston Norths, the Gisbornes, the Hawke's Bays, the Wanganuis, the others? It is very difficult to transfer learnings to another location. If it was easy, we would have done it. We wouldn't have these talks saying that we don't learn lessons. So I think it's still a challenge to us as a society to extract the essence of learnings from one location and embed them before the next event into the other locations that carry a risk profile that may be similar. So I think our work on Earth is not done, and there's much to be done on that front. And if you've got a simple way of doing it, please share it with us.
Jitendra.
I have a question. After working in 8 or 9 earthquakes, or being involved in many earthquakes in that way, I have one experience. What I find is people want to forget these traumatizing events. We want to remind them so the lessons could be learned, lessons could be implemented. How we find a balance? Maybe it may work differently in different culture, different religious context, but we have to find a balance so the lessons could be implemented without traumatizing further.
Sure.
Thank you.
That has been a concern, and it was certainly a concern after the September earthquake, about how as a community we engage in an affected community with these events. And I think there is a challenge there. At one hand, we want to be positive, reassuring, helping the community deal with a nasty adverse event. On the other hand is, how do we have those conversations that we can learn from it? And I think that there is often, time is a good healer. I'm sure you can have conversations in Christchurch now that you wouldn't have had the week after the event. So time will fix things. I think the way in which you address communities, because a lot of the time we'll tell a story of what happened. What people need to know is, so what can they do about it? So we know from much psychological research is that showing shock horror, and it came out of research around those driving ads, they don't actually make a difference. You cannot scare people into doing things. You need to motivate them into it. They need to see a positive outcome for an action that you want them to do. They need to be able to relate to it. So we're more likely to relate to a story when someone is telling us from someone who we can relate to. So I think sharing the ideas, and some positive things happen in Canterbury where schools in Wellington and other parts of New Zealand communicated with schools in Christchurch, and the children shared their experiences. People can relate better to people who they can relate to if you want to transfer messages. We do know that shock horror imagery about bad things, you must prepare because this could happen. We know it does not change, it does demotivates people to do it. It brings about more denial. So I think we need to have these positive outcomes around building resilience and giving people things that they can do or be part of doing. Because a lot of the time you talk to a householder, what can they do to make Wellington individually they can do? And it's about showing them things that they can do. I think there are a whole lot of other cultural issues that come into it, and different cultures, different communities and different organisations can address building resilience in different ways, and we need to explore what they are. Many of the solutions actually come from the communities at risk themselves, and we need to empower them to come up with ways forward instead of telling them what they need to do. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And those two questions unlocked so much of what David and the teams he's involved with are doing in the continued work from Canterbury and now the Kaikoura earthquakes. And it also makes me reflect that the need to celebrate the resilience of this technical community, many of whom have worked fairly continuously through from the Canterbury earthquakes, which of course is a segue into our final presenter and the recipient, one of the newly minted life members of the Earthquake Engineering Society from last night, in reflection in large part of his contribution following the Canterbury earthquakes and beyond. Please welcome Mike Stannard, Chief Engineer for MBIE.
Thank you, Dave. Firstly, I would like to say that MBIE is very proud to be the platinum sponsor for this conference. And you heard that first from Minister Joyce on Thursday morning. I think the objectives of both MBIE and the NZSEE align very well, and we're certainly very grateful for all the activity and the partnership arrangement we have with the Society. So, last word. How often does that happen? Certainly not at home. I see I've got about 10 minutes for my 20-minute slot, so I just thought you probably should just take a big deep breath in, big breath out, and just relax and imagine you're in a parallel universe where time goes backwards. So the longer I speak, the earlier you can leave. How do I move? Our esteemed President Peter asked me to talk about compliance, given the theme of this conference, the next generation of low damage and resilient structures. How do they fit into the whole building regulatory system, given that they are going to be obviously often more complicated, non-standard conventional designs? After all, from a regulator perspective, it's all about buildings being compliant with a building code. And from a practitioner perspective, it's about just doing enough to get your building consent and your code compliance certificate from, say, the Christchurch City Council. Really? While compliance is important, there's more to having a robust system. So, keeping with the CCC theme, and as is often my way, sometimes to my detriment, I widened the brief. If we're just talking about compliance, we can be asking the wrong question. Even compliance is a moving feast. So we firstly need to rely on the credibility of the overall system. MBIE is the steward of the whole system, and to have a credible system in the public mind, it won't work to achieve resilient communities without everybody playing their role. There's a model I've used before, a truss. And if all the truss elements are in place with good connections between them, you have a strong system. Starting from the left, research is fundamental and important both on the understanding of the hazard and how buildings perform. Robust, evidence-based planning and building regulations are needed to ensure that buildings are built or not built appropriate to the risk. Underpinned with good code standards and guidance. Owners are very important, and they will be key to the outcome. We need designers who know what they're doing with proper design review. Good builders and suppliers, and adequate construction monitoring and inspection with adequate maintenance during the life of the building. All underpinned by education and training and overridden by societal expectations. I've used the truss because our experience has shown that failure occurs when multiple links are inadequate. Not just one. If one cord breaks, then the truss might sag a bit, but not necessarily fail. There is redundancy in the system. To illustrate, Christchurch Stadium, poor design, poor welding, under-spec material supply. CTV collapse, poor design, poor construction, consenting issues. And weather tightness, obviously there was systemic failure. So, sticking with the credibility theme, the Royal Commission of Inquiry said that we can be confident in the system we have, but that improvements need to be made. And MBIE is using this framework of having an accountable workforce with the right skills which public can have confidence in. So that's the first P. Processes, regulatory and commercial processes that are risk-based, proportionate and efficient. Products, they are fit for purpose, and clear and reasonable building performance requirements that look to the future. And we're considering initiatives using that framework now. Obviously, there's been a whole lot of, just a few examples of some of the activity we have done to improve the credibility of our system. You've heard about the new building regulations throughout the conference. Building management following emergency, again, that's been well signalled. BCA accreditation review is a recent initiative to improve consenting. Occupational regulation review is an ongoing activity. And I've just mentioned there the geotechnical guidance and the New Zealand geotechnical database, which also has been covered in the conference to date. And I'm pleased to say that we've just got over the last two of the geotech modules, so we've now, for the first time ever in New Zealand, got a reasonably comprehensive suite of earthquake geotechnical guidance for the profession to improve consistency and activity. So, moving to our second C, compliance, a little bit of a regulatory system 101. And Andrew Stewart gave a more detailed account of this morning. Obviously, the Building Act at the top of the triangle, regulating of building work, establishing a licensing regime for building practitioners, and setting performance standards for buildings under the building code, with the four purposes outlined: buildings, safe buildings, contributing to health and physical independence and well-being of users, escape from fire, and promote sustainable development. We have our building code and the various different clauses of the building code. We're here probably focused more around stability under clause B, B1, but you really must not ignore the interaction with all of the other clauses. We know that improving energy efficiency can sometimes increase vulnerability for fire, and we've had the examples of the ACP panel fires in Melbourne and Dubai. And similarly, improving features for fire can increase structural vulnerability. And I guess over the years we've seen that with URMs, I guess as a result of probably the 1666 Great Fire of London. Here's just another example of the famous triangle showing multiple routes to compliance. And if I move on, trying to talk about trying to express it here as a continuum. So that on the left-hand side, you've got the deemed to comply route with acceptable solutions and verification methods, and then a continuum of alternative solutions, anything from equivalence to the performance outlined in the verification methods and into the deemed to comply route, right through to our first principles physics-based analysis. And obviously that along that continuum, you've got increasing expertise required, increasing testing, increasing scrutiny for getting your consents, and your peer review required. And that again is a continuum. I tried to fit in where the low damage solutions would fit. And you can see in the middle there, I've sort of put the base isolation sort of somewhere in the middle. It is an alternative solution, but it is pretty well documented, not so much in New Zealand, although Will Parker spoke of the initiative that we're trying to finalise here in New Zealand. It is reasonably well understood. There is obviously a lot of newer damaged technologies, low damage technologies, probably further towards the right-hand end. But there are low damage solutions under the deemed to comply route. And I think Professor Rene Lagos illustrated very much in his address the advantages of this approach with stiffer and stronger buildings being designed under the VM. And if I can just illustrate it also, and Helen Ferner has already talked about this in the previous session, I was fortunate enough also to be part of that Kumamoto reconnaissance team. And again, 3 months after the earthquake there, when we went, the city was intact. There was some damage, but it was pretty well, pretty functional. Christchurch 6 years later, still a huge amount of activity to do, and the CBD, while it's being built up quite rapidly now, there's still large areas that are car parks. By contrast, the New Zealand houses did very well. And again, Professor Wada talked about the damage to some of the post and beam heavy roof construction in Mashita town, whereas the New Zealand light roofed timber frame buildings performed pretty well. So let me move to my third theme of curiosity. I've just chosen 3 examples of how things have advanced over the last couple of millennia, really. And I know Professor Wada gave us other examples, but I've just chosen 3. I guess the accepted explanation for earthquakes remained unchallenged for about 2,000 years, since Aristotle announced in the middle of the 4th century BC that earthquakes were caused by farts of wind bursting out of underground tunnels, probably triggered by cavern collapse. That was until Lisbon in 1755, and that was the largest earthquake in Europe for more than 1,000 years, and it was reported to have released more energy than all other European earthquakes since that date combined. And people have compared it to the amount of energy released in the March 2011 Japanese earthquake. At that time, Lisbon was the 4th largest city in Europe and certainly the most religiously obsessed city. And it was in the middle of a church service on one of the holiest days of the year, All Saints' Day, 1st of November. Result was 1/10 of the population perished, and predictably, some said that the destruction was punishment from God for wickedness. However, there was an intellectual watershed, yielding attempts to develop scientific understanding that the earthquake had natural causes. Moving 200 years to the magnitude 9.2 Great Alaska earthquake, Mike West, 50 years later, he's the Alaskan state seismologist, for an address, looked at some of the reports made about the earthquake at the time, and he particularly cited the Life magazine, which you may remember was the premium monthly glossy magazine internationally and had obviously huge resources to graphically demonstrate what was happening. And he said that the only thing scientifically correct when he looked at those reports was the location of anchorage on the map. I mean, plate tectonics at that time was not accepted science at the time, and we take that for granted, obviously now. In a New Zealand context, obviously the society has had for a long time learnings from earthquakes. New Zealand has a long history of contribution to seismic engineering, knowledge and practice. We've had capacity design development here, lead rubber bearings, the 3 Ps, obviously, Paul A. Priestley and Park, or the other way around. The Society has sponsored reconnaissance learning from earthquakes, which has made a big contribution to the way we practice earthquake engineering in New Zealand. Canterbury has been a huge testing and learning ground, what worked and what didn't. And the Royal Commission provided a hugely important direction. And our recent published response report to the 189 recommendations is on the website. You can see the link there. We've had improved research capability recently, and a number of organisations with Quake Corps founded. Natural Hazards Research Platform has continued. The Science Challenges, Quake Centre and others are providing improved research capability and capacity. Legislative changes have occurred and are occurring, and we're anticipating getting powers to undertake investigations if needed. One other thing that I'd like to mention here is the review we've done of the New Zealand Seismic Hazard Model, and this is the first review we've done. We've done it in collaboration with EQC and GNS and the University of Canterbury. And we've had Professor Norm Abramson from Berkeley and a number of his experts who have looked at the whole model. They've lifted the lid. And for me, one of the really important findings is that we need to appreciate the uncertainty. And I've just got a little graph taken from the report. It just illustrates the black line there is the hazard as it's under the 2010 model, which is probably a bit different to what we've got in our 1170 at the moment, but near enough. If you take the 5 percentile or the 95 percentile confidence levels, you can see at the 500-year event there is a factor of 2 of uncertainty. It's that uncertainty that so we really do have to consider what's going to happen when we get greater shaking than the code says. And that uncertainty is really only the modelling uncertainty. It's not taking into account some of the unknowns that we really are only just finding out. So how can you sorry, let's just start again. The last 15 years has certainly been a turbulent period for the building sector, and everybody has been busy. We've had leaky buildings, collapsed buildings, and Canterbury and Kaikoura have provided the public with a much greater awareness of the impact of earthquakes. We are generally constructing significantly better buildings, however, significant challenges remain, and consistent assessment of existing buildings would be high on that list. So how can we as practitioners contribute to a robust system to improve the resilience of New Zealand communities? Firstly, sticking with our 3C framework, I suggest practitioners should understand the system as a whole and understand that the role of the BCA is not a cheap design review process. Articulate to clients the choices they are getting, and I think we had a very nice presentation from Jared Keane on the previous session with great examples of how clear communication is needed, and Ron provided some further examples of that. Collaboration during the design process, architects, the structural geotech fire obviously, planners, seismologists, whoever else. That whole collaboration process has been hugely important, I think, and I think it's been quite significant since Canterbury. The use of design features reports to make it clear what we're trying to aim for the BCAs will improve things considerably. Load paths, I don't need to emphasise too much, but redundancy, as I mentioned before, talking about secondary load paths, what's going to happen if you get something greater than that particular requirement. Understand uncertainties, the design limitations, and obviously keep current with the hugely changing technology and knowledge. Don't settle for adequate, seek improvement. So, back to my earlier parallel universe, where all the work is being undertaken in a credible manner and there is public trust, everything is compliant, curiosity dominates, and poetry abounds. I leave you with this message of hope and poignancy from Janet Frame, one of our famous writers and poets, to enjoy at your leisure. I think it's ironic that this is on a billboard on what is now a car park of 61 Molesworth Street, the site of a building that failed in the Kaikoura earthquake. I wish us all the best in striving for improvements to the resilience of our communities. Thank you very much.
Mike's hallmark is an incredible technical curiosity, and we can take from that perhaps, possibly, that curiosity, learning from history and poetry, is much more insightful than compliance. I'll leave that for Mike to comment later. Look, we'll wrap this session up. You've had 2 hours of considerable wisdom from a very thoughtful and insightful group of gentlemen. I guess as we process what we've learnt from the conference technically against the messages we've had this afternoon, this session has highlighted both the challenges and the opportunities for us as earthquake engineering professionals, and communications by storytelling is one of the both a challenge and an opportunity ahead of us, as well as Mike has just said. Never lose sight of the uncertainty in our work as we communicate it. I think you'll agree with me that you've had a great session and set of insights from these speakers. I have a wee token of appreciation from the Society for each of them after the session. But can you please, and I believe they've well and truly earned it, so can you please join with me in once again thanking our panellists.